one of our core primary partners and one of the most important voices in our state is the Commonwealth Institute. And we are very lucky to have Michael Cassidy, the CEO of the Commonwealth Institute, with us this morning to talk about the budget, as well as revenues, and then also healthcare reform and some of the other big policy issues that we may be facing in the coming few months in the next session. Michael is based in Richmond, but the Commonwealth Institute looks broadly at state tax, finance, revenue, and budget information that comes from the state. They analyze and provide nonpartisan, data-driven information that all of us can use, that everyone in the state can use, to help better understand the budget picture, and also how to take that information and apply it in any advocacy that we might want to do, in any education that we might want to do with the media, with our funders, with the community at large. So they are really an essential partner to us and provide a lot of information. I hope that you will enjoy very much hearing the presentation today. We're going to let Michael speak first as you follow the agenda about the budget, and then we'll have Q&A related to that, and then we'll look at some other policy issues. But your points of view, your questions, your comments are welcome and encouraged. I'll let Michael decide when and how he wants to take them. But if there's anything we don't cover today that you really want to make sure we follow up on, make sure you let me know, and we'll make sure that we are able to get information to you as you need it. So without further ado, let's turn it over to Michael. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you. Thank you, Melissa, and thank you all for coming. I'm Michael Cassidy. It's a pleasure to be with you this morning to talk about our state fiscal and economic issues and challenges, and then also about some of the key issues around our state's health care and safety net programs. The focus of a lot of our work at the Commonwealth Institute is around how state fiscal and economic policies affect low and moderate income Virginians. And that's sort of a lens through which we conduct a very significant chunk of our analysis. And so to be with a group of you all who focus on the needs of folks as it relates to housing is really right up our alley. And in particular, an area that I think when we talk about some of these broader fiscal policy trends, some of the issues around how workers are faring in our economy and what the challenges are in our state budget for providing for the growing needs in our community, I hope you can see the connections to some of the core issues that you all work on in the housing arena. It's not an area that I'm particularly knowledgeable about, and so what I hope we can gain from today's discussion is a chance to talk about some of these key issues around how the state budget works and how the state budget gets built and what key issues are facing the Commonwealth, but then also make those linkages to some of the particular issues that you all may be dealing with in terms of your own work or the communities or individuals that you serve. And so as Melissa said, first I'll talk about the state budget and some of the issues we're facing there, and then we can open up for Q&A in that section, and then we can move on to talking about healthcare reform and other safety net issues, and then have Q&A after that as well as a way to kind of break up but also connect the two segments of this morning's presentation. So first, let me start with some basic information around the state budget to try to set the table, if you will, for how the issues that Virginia wrestles with the state budget fall into the greater context of building a state budget and how that whole process works. And then I'd like to also talk about what some of the recent trends in Virginia's state budget and economy have been, to hopefully share some ideas and deepen awareness around what are some of the key pressure points and issues that the Commonwealth has been struggling with, and then where those things look going forward. And then we can open up for Q&A. So I'll hit on those three topics in this first segment this morning. So first, the state budget is among the most important policy-making tools that Virginia has. Not only does it allocate a huge range of resources, but it also includes often very significant amounts of policy language and information and legislation within the document. So even if you're sitting here thinking, well, my program doesn't actually get much in the way of state general fund support, or we're pretty much a fee-based organization, or we have money from the federal government, so we don't have to worry so much about how the General Assembly appropriates money, I hope that you can, by the end of this morning, see that, in fact, you do have a stake in the state budget, because even if the state isn't necessarily the source of the chunk of your funding, there are going to be very significant both budget as well as policy language and information and decisions made in the state budget making process that will likely affect both your programs directly, but more importantly, the people you serve in many other areas. And so I hope part of this morning's discussion will allow you to sort of see and understand that. So to begin with, Virginia, I think there's sort of a few key points to sort of understand about the state budget that help explain a lot of what happens in Capitol Square every year with regard to our state budget. First of all, Virginia, like almost all states, has to balance its budget every year. What that means is the state's operating budget has to be balanced. So revenues have to match expenditures. This is obviously markedly different than how the federal government's budget works, where the federal government is allowed to run deficits, and the same is not the case at the state level. And so therefore, when we think about the budget choices and priorities that Virginia faces every year, it's really driven by the need to have expenditures match revenues. And so there's a whole array of choices that have to be made in order to bring that into balance. Secondly, although it's really a whole set of numbers in a big thick book typed in like Courier font that's practically unreadable by non-experts, the state budget really is about our priorities as a community. There's all kinds of expressions that sort of get to this big point, which is, you measure what you treasure and you put your money where your mouth is, pick your favorite metaphor. But really what that gets to is, if it's not in the budget, it's not a priority. If you're meeting with a lawmaker and they're talking about how your program or the people you serve really are a key priority for them, but there's no funding in the budget to back up that sentiment, then it really isn't a priority. Because the way we actually go ahead and deliver services to folks, the way we actually meet the needs of our community is through funding. And it's through providing services, which takes people that require salaries, and it takes goods and services that require money to buy. And so I think fundamentally understanding how, although it may present itself as a wide array of numbers, in big numbers with lots of zeros next to them in many of the top line numbers, what we're really talking about is what are our priorities here in Virginia? How are we taking the resources of the Commonwealth and deploying them to meet the needs of our community? And so trying to therefore understand it from that perspective, I think can help motivate an awareness around how essential it is to be engaged in the budget process. Because it is a legislative process that is undertaking among the most important things we do as a community, which is deploy our resources. And in so many ways, the budget itself has a whole host of key policy issues in it that you'll have a stake in. Now, what do I mean by key policy issues? What I'm talking about is when you look through the state budget, there isn't just a line that says, we hereby appropriate $100 million for housing assistance for low-income Virginians. There's often, following those kinds of appropriation lines, all kinds of additional language that provides guidance and instruction from the General Assembly about how that money is going to be spent. So there may be language around who's eligible for the money, or what populations are eligible, what service providers are eligible. There may be very detailed information about how much money the people in those agencies can be paid, or how many hours might be spent on a certain task, or how reporting on the outcomes and outputs of a particular program have to be made. And so there'll be often a whole wide array of policy within the budget that will be equally as important in many ways to meeting the needs of the people you serve or the communities you work with as the money themselves. And having an awareness of what it is that the General Assembly is doing, not only with regard to appropriating the money, but also with regard to how they've laid out statutory guidance in how that money is going to be spent and on whom, is also critically important. The other thing I want to mention about the budget is that Virginia operates under a 2-year budget. So that means every other year the General Assembly enacts a 2-year budget. This stands in contrast to the federal government, which operates on a 1-year budget. And so what the General Assembly does is it enacts a budget for 2 years, and then in the following year it makes amendments to that budget. But fundamentally the underlying budget has been enacted for 2 years, so it's called a biennial budget. And when I talk about how the budget has to be balanced, both in terms of the revenues and the expenses, that means it has to be balanced not just on paper, where the 2-year budget has to be balanced in terms of all the allocations that are made, but then every year we also have to make sure that expenditures matched revenues. And so there's an additional budget drill that's done, which is called the caboose budget, which goes through and tries to make sure we true up the actual expenditures versus revenues in a given year as we're getting close to the end of that fiscal year. So even though we operate under a 2-year budget, and it's really important to understand that that's the dynamic in which we're operating, there is still a great deal of annual budget work that goes on. In the case of, let's say, a declining economy, you're going to be having mid-year cuts and end-of-the-year cuts in programs and expenditures in order to bring it back into balance to declining revenues. During a time when, let's say, revenues are coming in above what we're forecast, you'll have decisions around how to allocate those additional dollars. And so all of this plays a role, I think, in trying to make my point, which is that every year there's some kind of budget debate and budget discussion going on in Virginia. And so it's important to be knowledgeable about what those are and what the situation that you're dealing with in, because it can play a very important role in helping you determine your strategy as well as your tactics with whatever issue you may be working on. Another thing that I want to mention to you is, because we have a 2-year budget, but because we have a 1-term governorship, it can create some really strange disconnects in terms of how Virginia builds and executes its budget. So in a strange sort of way, there's actually only one budget that any governor sees from proposal to enactment to execution. When a new governor comes into office in Virginia in early January, their predecessor has just introduced a budget days before they left office. And then they have a very short period of time to make changes or amendments to that predecessor's budget. Because our General Assembly sessions are fairly short in Virginia, 60 days in the long sessions and only 45 days in the short sessions, there's very little time to make significant changes to that. So when you think about that, a governor comes into office and basically the first half of their term, they're operating off of their predecessor's budget. Especially because even if you have a change of party from one governor to the next, building a budget is no easy task. It takes the entire state government apparatus the better part of a year to build a biennial budget. So when you think about the change of administration, a handful of new aides to the governor and new appointees scrambling around trying to make significant changes to the budget in just a period of a few weeks, that's a pretty Herculean task. And so usually what you see are some high priority changes, some marginal changes, but very significant base and structural elements still staying in place. So I think that's an interesting wrinkle to our particular political environment in Virginia that's important to keep in mind, which is the ways in which our 1-term governorship kind of collide with our 2-year budget process, so that there's fewer ways in which governors are able to put their imprint on budgets, especially in their early years in office. So the budget process is also one that I think can often be quite a mystery to folks, especially if you're not really engaged in it in a regular way. So what I'd like to do now is talk a little bit about kind of that calendar and schedule for how Virginia builds and considers budget proposals that can hopefully give you a sense of the different seasons that go with the budget. And this too can help inform your strategies and tactics for engagement on the budget. So one of the key things that happens is the governor in the springtime typically provides guidance out to the agencies around key budget priorities, key long-term big picture kind of budget goals or parameters to then use for guiding their own deliberations on the budget. So agencies typically spend the better part of the summer building their agency budgets that are going to go into the governor's office for consideration. They then come to the governor's office. The Department of Planning and Budget is the governor's budget office, long about September. This is, I think, a really important period of time that a lot of advocates don't really make the most of. A lot of folks, even if they are engaged on the budget, they think of it as more, you're waiting to hear what the governor's introduced budget's going to be in December, and then what the General Assembly does it during the session. But what I would like to introduce to you this morning is this idea that there is this very important window of opportunity which occurs during the summer at the agency level. And it's a critically important time to engage with the folks at the agencies you work with, at the secretariats that you work with, to talk about the issues you're seeing in your programs, that you're seeing in the communities that you serve. Because that's the period of time where they themselves are building their own budget requests into the governor's office. Now, a lot of times the answer you may get is, thank you very much, we'll keep you under advice, but they're not going to be able to give you a decision, obviously, because they aren't the ones who are the final decision makers or arbiters of these things. But it's still critically important for them to understand what the dynamics are that you are seeing in your programs and services and in your communities, and how they intersect with funding needs or challenges with regard to the budgets and the program itself. Or the policy that was included in the budget, or any other policy that you're wrestling with. Because as I mentioned at the outset, the budget also includes a significant amount of policy guidance and policy proposal, statutory policy language. So for example, let's say you have a program that isn't even necessarily one that's driven, primarily funded by the state, but rather where the state agency is a conduit for federal dollars and matched with local dollars or whatever other kind of funding sources you may have for the program. But that there's certain statutory language or language in the Code of Virginia that is causing problems for your ability to deliver the service effectively. Or the federal government has made some change at the federal level with the program that doesn't quite comport with how the statute works here in Virginia or how the program has typically worked, and there's some kind of mismatch going on. That's the perfect time when they're considering the budget to also start identifying these policy issues, because those too can make their way into the budget and into the budget proposal. So, long about Labor Day, the budget proposals come in from the agencies into the Department of Planning and Budget. They have an analyst for every one of the agencies who work very hard to figure out what's in the agency request, what are they asking for, how does it match up to guidance, what's going on the top line, because when they rack up everybody's requests, I can guarantee you there's always more money being asked for than there is to give out. So there's going to have to be some kind of exercise to identify what key priorities are and how to make the budget balance. At the same time, other people within the governor's office, particularly in the Secretary of Finance, are getting information on how revenues are looking. So they're getting latest information on what's happening with the economy, what's happening with state tax revenue, what's happening with other key elements that make up the revenue side of the budget. And all that is coming together as they're trying to figure out priorities. So this is obviously another critical period of engagement, because the discussions that are going on between the secretariats and the governor's budget office are around, explain this, justify this, how does this work? We're not going to be able to fund at that level, so it's going to have to be something lower. And so not only taking that message you communicated earlier in the year into the governor's office and to his key staff, but also providing ongoing information and updates to strengthen the efforts of, let's say, the secretariat who might have put that funding request into the agency request is critically important in this phase. Because a lot of stuff ends up on the cutting room floor during the period by which the governor's budget office is considering things, because they've got to make the thing balance. Then, usually in early December then, the governor introduces his budget or budget amendments to the General Assembly. So just before Christmas, he puts out the budget. One key thing that I want to make at this point is the governor will always introduce a balanced budget. So one of the things I think that advocates sort of struggle with is this concept of budget shortfalls and then the budget's introduced is balanced. It is never a question that the budget is going to be balanced. That is an obligation of the governor to introduce a balanced budget. It is the obligation of the General Assembly to enact a balanced budget. The key question for you all, and the key issue to keep in mind is, what did we do to get there? So, what have we cut in terms of funding, in terms of services, in terms of eligibility to make that budget balanced? What decisions have we made in terms of funding other priorities as opposed to this set of priorities, perhaps the ones that you work on? What kinds of things are we doing on the revenue side that determine how much money was available to even allocate? And to have an understanding of those decisions that went into the budget is very, very important. So don't get hung up around, it's a balanced budget. That's not in question. It's what did we have to do to get there? This can provide very useful information in terms of understanding what's in the governor's budget, but then it can also be hugely important in helping inform your strategies and tactics for engagement with the General Assembly. Because we live in a democracy. The governor does not have all the say in the budget allocation decisions of this Commonwealth. So if there were a set of decisions made in the governor's budget proposal to the General Assembly that you don't like, you've got this other window, this other season of engagement for when it comes over to the General Assembly. But that needs to be driven by what document is in front of them. What is in that document from the governor's budget office that comes on over? Just to give you an idea of how critically important the governor's introduced budget is to this whole process that occurs in the General Assembly, the governor's introduced budget actually gets translated into bill language and submitted as a bill by the chairman of the money committees, Senate Finance and House Appropriations. So you have SB 30 and HB 30, or whatever the number is in any given year. So it's sort of an interesting concept. If you think about the division of power and sort of executive branch versus legislative branch, his priorities become literally verbatim the language of the bill that is the beginning of the consideration for the General Assembly. It is the launching off point for the General Assembly. In other budget situations, in other states, at the federal level, that's not the case. They may receive budget recommendations from the governor, but then they go about writing their own bill and they do their own thing. Whereas here, that governor's budget is a critically important starting point for the whole deliberation during the General Assembly session. Let me explain what that comes down to in a sort of a wacky way, just to give you an understanding of how important, how strange it can play out. Let's say a governor was proposing to cut children's health insurance in our state by $10 million. Advocates for children's health do an excellent job of advocating for how that kind of a cut would be terrible for the people that they serve and for the kids in the Commonwealth. And so the General Assembly restores $5 million of that cut. And so they're not going to cut the children's health insurance program by $10 million, they're only going to cut it by $5 million. When the Senate and House budgets come out, the line item for the children's health insurance program is going to be plus $5 million. So to read that on its face, you're going to go, oh, they increased funding for the children's health insurance program by $5 million. No, they did not. They cut it by $5 million, but they didn't cut it as much as the governor proposed, and so they added back $5 million from his proposal to cut 10. But it just shows you how even the information that you see during the Money Committee deliberations on the budget and stuff like that is all based off of that baseline. Now, for folks who don't do this for a living and live and breathe all this stuff, this produces obviously a very significant barrier to engagement, because you can't look at the documents that come out of the money committees, for example, and have much understanding of what exactly they're doing, because it's all off this baseline of the governor's introduced budget, which itself was off. So this is why it's really important to try to figure out ways to explain and translate the arcane language and procedures of the budget build process in a way that more people can understand it. And that's one of the key reasons why we were founded 6 years ago, was to be an independent source of insight and analysis to do that. Sort of the credibility of a JLARC and a DPB, but with the heart and soul of an advocacy organization, because our whole focus is how things affect low and moderate income people in the state.
Michael, what's JLARC?
The Joint Legislative Audit and Review Commission is a very important agency within the General Assembly, which tackles various studies and evaluations of key programs and different services within all of state government. They get their assignments from the General Assembly. It's a joint committee of both delegates and senators, both Republicans and Democrats, and they work out an agenda of studies and evaluations. And JLARC is widely respected across the country as a very credible agency who does very solid work on the whole ranges of public policy issues. And so one of the key actors and stakeholders in the policymaking world is JLARC. Has JLARC done an evaluation of this? What did JLARC say about this? That JLARC study from 2 years ago found these are all things you commonly hear around public policy discussions in Virginia. And so when we got founded, that was the whole concept, was how do you build an organization that can have that depth of credibility, but can actually produce information in a way that makes it more accessible to people, and that's timely and credible as well as accessible. So then the horse race begins. The General Assembly session starts its session and they begin their deliberation on the budget. And typically around the midway point of the session, so whether it's a 60-day session about 30 days in, or if it's a 45-day session halfway through that, they will produce a budget. This is another very critical period of engagement for you, for any advocate, for any program or any issue. Because that state budget that the General Assembly produces is also going to have funding as well as policy information in it and findings in it. So one of the key things is get to know the people on the money committees. Understand who's on the committees and who's on what subcommittees, particularly the subcommittees that deal with the issues that you are concerned about and that you work with. That's going to be the starting point, especially the subcommittee deliberations on things, because each subcommittee is charged with producing a budget that is balanced, that funds the key priorities towards an overall budget that's balanced. So when you think about who your best friends in the General Assembly are, figure out, are they members of the money committees? Are they a member of the Senate Finance Committee or the House Appropriations Committee? What subcommittees do they work on? If your best friends aren't on their key subcommittee, figure out who is on that subcommittee and work on strategies to reach out to them and engage them. They may not be from the community where you are or where your program serves, but who do you know in your own network who is working in that, is a constituent of that individual? How is it that you can partner with them to bring their own district-specific information to bear on your overall broad policy or services area issue that you want to bring up? Because this is critically important in terms of the engagement, since the subcommittees will make some very significant determinations around funding levels and how different issues are going to be tackled in the state budget. So then, the other thing that I want to point out around the General Assembly's consideration of the budget is it's not like other legislation that's considered. So if you have a standalone housing bill, let's say to create a housing trust fund, you might have a patron for that bill and a whole bunch of co-patrons, and that thing is going before a certain committee, and you all understand that, and you are working hard to get a favorable vote out of that subcommittee or that committee. So typically then there are these periods where the subcommittees or the committees are considering those bills, and you know that is the drop-dead point. If that bill can make it out of committee, then we're well on our way. Or if it dies in committee, oh dear, that is a huge setback. It's not the same way for the budget deliberations. The General Assembly receives the governor's budget, and then they hold a series of hearings throughout the early days of the session. Each subcommittee is holding their own hearings, hearing from people from the administration about what's in the governor's request, hearing from people outside of the administration, advocates, other key stakeholders about what issues are going on in that. But it's not like at the end of that hearing they take a vote. okay, we're going to vote on the Housing Trust Fund part of the budget right now. No, they just take everything under advisement. And so you don't actually get your first signal about what posture the General Assembly is taking on the budget until they release their budgets. Their entire budget proposals come out always on a Sunday. It's delightful. I've never learned why we do this on a Sunday. The House typically goes first in the early afternoon, and then the Senate Finance Committee releases theirs later that day. And so everybody's scrambling to have an understanding of what's in the budgets. So that's going to be your first glimpse of it, what their actual decisions are. Now, this presents a really significant challenge for advocacy and engagement on the budget. Because after that budget comes out on Sunday, that bad boy is on the floor like within 72 hours. Just a few short days later, the floor of each chamber is considering the budget that has just been voted out. So just think of your window of engagement in terms of objecting to something that's in, or explaining the bad effects that something is, or saying how some funding priority is critical and should be maintained, is very, very narrow. From that pathway, from Senate Finance Committee deliberation to Senate floor action on that bill. Typically then they each vote out their bills, then they swap them, send them over to the other chambers, they then vote down the other chambers' bills and substitute their own bills for those, and then they call a conference. And an even smaller set of decision makers get together to start deliberating around the final conference decisions on the budget. This is then another key period of engagement. And in fact, something I would articulate from day one, people need to have not only a list of who's on your subcommittee in the money committees, who's on the money committees, but who typically are the conferees. And to always be having in your strategy and tactics engagement, outreach to, and being in relationship with those members of the conference committee. A few of them will switch. But if I were to put a list up of who's been on the conference committee over the last several years in Virginia, there would just be a few people have changed, but it's often the same people. And certainly the same roles, like the chairs of the committees, things like that. So that's another key list of stakeholders to stay engaged with, and on the front end, to think, how do we reach out to this person, because he's not in our district, he's not on any of the key committees, but he's going to be on the conference committee. And so having him understand this program, this community, these services is really important, because there are these small room deliberations that go on. And then ideally they come to a resolution, vote the thing out, and send it over to the governor's office. Typically, the votes on the budget is the very last thing the General Assembly does. It often triggers stalemates and extensions of the legislative session, which we had one this past year. We've had them in many years in the past. And so it is the last sort of thing to come out of the General Assembly session. And then it goes over to the governor, who then has 30 days in which to consider all of the legislation passed by the General Assembly, and the ability, with strong authority, to make line item vetoes and amendments. And then when the General Assembly comes back for a one-day veto session, a month later, they deal with all of these amendments and changes he has made. That whole period then is yet another period of engagement. The General Assembly has acted. Figure out what's in that final conference agreement. They cut your budget by $10 million in the House, by $1 million in the Senate. The final conference agreement cuts it by $3 million. Know that. You got to know that, to know that's what we're dealing with. And then articulate what your views on that decision are to the governor's office and his staff as they determine what's the governor's position going to be on this budget and all the priorities in it. And then, when he makes his budget amendments, you have one more bite at the apple, which is that one-day veto session from the General Assembly. So again, you're back to trying to figure out, how do we engage these General Assembly members to say, we support this amendment that was made by the governor, or we object to this amendment that was made by the governor. He has stricken such and such language. That's essential for us to be able to execute this program right. He has cut the funding out of this. He has reduced the increase in funding that the General Assembly made. And they can therefore, it's a teeny window, but it is a legitimate window to then engage with General Assembly members on how they vote on the governor's amendments in terms of what he did while the budget was sitting on his lap. And then we're done. And at this point, it's the spring. And by this point, the agencies, everyone kind of drags themselves home and gets some good sleep for a few weeks. And then you pretty much start it all over again and try to figure out how to build the next year's budget. But I think I hope that you can see from some of these explanations of the seasons and the life cycle of it all, that there are these periods of engagement. They are within different branches of government. They're within different stakeholders within each branch. The asks and the dynamic of what's going on in a particular period is different, but each of them holds opportunities for education and engagement with our elected officials to understand these key issues. Does anybody have any questions on that? I think this might be a good point to break, and then I can talk about some of the recent issues we've wrestled with here in Virginia around how the recession's impacted our budget and what some of the future challenges are.
One of the constitutional amendments on the ballot this year is about allowing the General Assembly more time, I think, to schedule the veto session.
Yes.
Does your organization have a position on
No.
the amendment? It doesn't affect the timeline that the governor has to send stuff over. It just gives them more time to act.
Yeah, and believe it or not, this is really just based on some religious holidays that often fall in the springtime.
Okay.
So when you have things like the Easter holidays, things like Passover, it can sometimes create some extremely uncomfortable timing situations that we're actually hauling everybody back into Richmond. And believe it or not, the way it's written here, we actually will have to change the Constitution to make that kind of a scheduling change. So yeah, it's just sort of it's the kind of thing we really should just do,
It's a housekeeping.
It's a housekeeping.
That's the process.
Yep, exactly, yep. Now, from time to time, there are bills that try to do much more structural changes to the state budget, timing issues. So for example, in recent years, there's been discussion around, this is absurd, that a new governor inherits the budget of his predecessor, and then, so let's flip that, and let's have the 2-year budget be introduced, in the other year, so that he or she just has the first year of their administration executing the last year of their predecessor's budget, and then gets to introduce their own budget and isn't living under the predecessor's budget for a full 2 years. So there's some discussions with that, but that would be obviously a substantive change. This is very just much housekeeping. Okay, so yes, Rick.
Well, this is not so much a question, but I'm curious if you have a comment on it as much as just emphasizing one of the things Michael said about the importance of various individuals in that process. And for those of you who were engaged with the Housing Trust Fund campaign last year, you will know that that only happened because we had a couple of very strong advocates in the Senate, among the Senate conferees. But for those couple of individuals, there would have been nothing put into the budget out of the mortgage settlement fund. So it is critically important to figure out where you have some leverage and work on that.
I just want to ask this question from Michael's amazing off-the-cuff conversation, which is why we have Michael here. Is there anybody who did not learn something about the budget process from this? Is there anybody who did not learn something? I think that our budget cycle is very intimidating, and part of that is inadvertent, and part of it may or may not be deliberate. But it's such an important document. I think it's great that we have the Commonwealth Institute to crystallize down and to be a resource for all of us on understanding when and how we can be most effective without having to be the Commonwealth Institute ourselves. So. Yeah. So and part of our mission is we do all of our independent research and analysis on key issues, especially on identifying on the tax side, on the revenue system, on identifying budget priorities, and so. We do a lot of big picture macro budget analysis to identify key trends and things like that. And certainly part of our work is to try to then use that information and connect to key stakeholders like lawmakers, like administration officials, and other key stakeholders in understanding those findings and these key issues. And we also work very hard to attract attention to our work, to try to speak through the media to the public about these issues in an effort to try to shape the public understanding of what the key priorities are.
But one of the other key parts to our mission is to collaborate with others who also care about these issues to strengthen their own advocacy on state fiscal policy issues. And so these kinds of sessions and this kind of work is part of our mission, is part of why we were started. And so, we're happy to do that kind of stuff. And there's stuff that we don't know enough about, and so you may call us with a question and we'll say, that is just not a part of the budget we have really looked at before. And so understand that may be the answer you get back, but mostly we're able to at least help provide some guidance around, especially these bigger issues around sort of the dynamics of what's happening in the process, and for sure the ability to help give some suggestions of other sources of information. In addition, my staff is just very talented and conversant in data analysis and research methods and stuff, and so we're usually able to, even if we don't know the specific part of the budget you're talking about particularly well, talk through different ways of trying to crack the nut that you're talking about or tackle the issue that you've identified. Yeah.
I think Virginia, particularly Northern Virginia, has sort of a unique link with the federal government in lots of ways. So I know that you talked about the Virginia budget process, and that it's certain staff in the governor's office that is sort of responsible for keeping an eye on the revenue streams coming in, and I would imagine a lot of that is working with the federal agencies to make sure whatever grants or whatever that they're counting on. Does your organization sort of do a parallel track of watching the governor's office, evaluating how well they are working with the feds to bring the revenue in?
No, we don't typically do much in that way around figuring out, did the housing department apply for the right grants to draw down the most HUD money or something like that. We sort of are more at the level of, something like the Federal Recovery Act. The very significant amount of state fiscal stabilization funding that was available. Is Virginia taking advantage of all of that money? Or also sort of looking at the ways in which state revenue policies intersect with federal revenue policies. So, for example, federal tax policies and the ways in which federal decision-making in taxes can have a very significant impact on our state revenue system. So, for example, if the Congress enacts a new business tax break, every year Virginia has a decision: do we conform our state tax code to the federal code? And so we are very attentive to figuring out, well, Congress just did this on accelerating how businesses can expense things. How would that in fact impact Virginia's revenue system if we were to agree to conform with that? And therefore help us inform educating lawmakers and saying, you didn't have a vote on that thing, but Congress just blew a $20 million hole in your revenue system, because unless we decouple from that, the businesses will have a greater deduction at the federal level, which will translate down into a lost revenue from the state side. So that's most of how we do that work. Then on safety net programs and stuff like that, we're very, very involved with so many safety net programs and key programs that serve the needs of low and moderate income people are federal state joint programs in some way, shape, or form, be it Medicaid or food stamps or TANF or you name it, and so we often do sets of work around that. Yes, Ali.
Michael, you mentioned in an example about how part of what's difficult with advocacy is that all the numbers are based off of the governor's budget. And so if you see something as an increase, it might not actually be an increase. So when the governor introduces a budget, and then each of the money committees in each of the houses introduce their own budget, are those just amendments to the introduced governor's budget?
Essentially, yep. So, for example, when the money committees release when the money committees release their budgets, so you'll see things like in a lot of the tables that will be in the materials, the supporting materials that they share, will be like this kind of an issue of plus $5 million for children's health. It's like, wait a second, that's because they put $5 million back of the 10 that was proposed to be cut. In addition, when you see like the language of the governor's budget amendments that'll be coming out this year, because we're in an amendment year. We enacted a 2-year budget in the spring, and so when he introduces his budget in December, it's going to be an amendment year. You will actually see in his budget will be cross-out strike-through language. So we actually look through and it says, slice. It said the budget that was enacted said $4.5 million for this thing, and this is going to say $4.75 million or $4.25 million or something like that. And there'll be language like that, which is again off of that base enacted budget. And so all this is to say that you have to sort of connect with folks and build your own understanding of some of these things in order to understand what's really going on with some of these decisions, so that you're not caught unawares by just looking at the four corners of a document and seeing plus $5 million. Oh, that's good. They increased children's health by $5 million. Yes, Bob?
Michael, could you talk a little bit about the kind of the disconnect that a lot of us felt about thinking we were in such a tight budget situation, yet seeing such a large budget surplus
Sure.
from the previous year? And could you talk about who gets to decide how the budget surplus is spent?
Yes. So, so this issue of kind of our budget surpluses in recent years is a really important one, because it goes back to a point I made earlier, which is the key question for all of us, I would argue, is understanding how did we get there? How did we get to that balanced budget that was introduced? How did we get to that balanced budget that was enacted? And then in this case, how did we get to the surplus that was booked? And it's an accounting surplus. And let's be very clear about that. And there's nothing wrong with me saying that. I am not saying that any public official who talked about the surplus was misleading the public. It was an accounting surplus. As I mentioned at the outset, we have to balance the budget. Revenues have to match expenditures. And so what that leads to is, a very, very, significant effort to figure out where are we at the end of a given fiscal year in terms of our expenses, and then where were we in terms of our revenue. That's just a fundamental part of what it means to have to balance your budget every year. So a few things go into the surpluses that we've been experiencing. And I'm going to talk broadly about them because we've had them for accounting surpluses for the last few years. So I'm not going to deal with a particular situation, but I want to just lay the groundwork for how that dynamic comes into play. First of all, the governor, in building his own budget, and this period of time where the Secretary of Finance and other key stakeholders around the revenue side are feeding into providing information around how much revenue we're going to have to spend, that is critically important. Not only does the governor have his own staff to do that, like the tax commissioner and his staff and the Secretary of Finance and his staff, but there's also a couple of independent advisory groups that advise the governor on it. And these have great acronyms. They are called GACRE and JABE. And so there's the Governor's Advisory Committee on Revenue Estimating, and then there's the Joint Advisory Board of Expenditures. So the two of them, one has got a bunch of budget people and a bunch of economists and other finance and macroeconomic kind of experts who look at what's going on in the overall economy, both at the national level and here in Virginia, and they contract with a macroeconomic consulting firm that provides then analysis and information on what's happening with the economy and what the economic forecast is looking like for the state and for the nation. And then they give a few different scenarios, basically a sort of neutral, steady scenario, an optimistic one, and a pessimistic one. And then the group, the governor's advisory group, then settles on a consensus recommendation to give to the governor's staff to say, we think the economy is improving, we think the optimistic forecast is likely, we think the economy is softening, we better be careful here, or we think it's about steady and that middle range one is about right. And that then gets fed into the kind of numbers that they use around how much tax revenue the state's going to have, and then and that's going to plays a key starting point in the budget bill. So one key factor in this was sort of continued use of more pessimistic assumptions around the economic performance of the state. You see how that plays a very key role in defining the issue as this is how much money we're going to have to spend because this is how the economy is going to perform. And then it's like, okay, I'm going to make all these budget decisions around allocating how much money I have to spend. That's the sort of very key part in that. So then, as we get through executing the year, the General Assembly takes those revenue estimates. They might tinker with them a little bit themselves, but mostly they bring them forward in their own budget, they enact the budget. Then, as the economy performs as we get through the year, there's variation from that, because that's the difference between forecasting something and then your actuals. And when there's a difference, when the economy performed better, even slightly better than what was forecast, you can see there's now more revenue to play with, because the whole thing was built off of a more pessimistic assumption around economic performance. That was a key part. Secondly, was important changes made to agency expenditures. You know, agencies were told to cut, to reduce expenditures, to consolidate programs, to cancel unnecessary expenditures, that sort of thing. And so a whole host of other savings were generated through those kinds of strategies and dynamics. Now, one way to look at that is, you know, we're making government more efficient and we're streamlining and things like that, which we all support, the most efficient and effective execution of public services. But I think for folks in your shoes should ask the very question of, well, what did the agency do to get here, to generate those savings? Was it consolidating their contract to buy pencils with another agency, and so by buying more they got a better price on buying those pencils? Or was it cutting a program? Or was it delaying launching a program so that they didn't expend the money? That's a horse of a different color, right? I mean, who cares how much that's a great thing that they figured out more creative ways to save on procurement and contracting and things like that. Whereas the other, I suspect you all would have some issues with a decision, an agency budget execution decision around, you know, deciding to cut a program or not launch a program, or to not fill vacant positions or something like that. So again, understanding how we got there to generate those savings is very important. So that's sort of the crux, the thrust of the biggest bulk of what was the surpluses came from those two big buckets. So then you raised another point, Bob, which was who gets to decide how that's spent. So that's a very important question, and I think also important to understand the dynamics of creating end-of-year surpluses versus appropriating the money on the front end. The statute determines a chunk of where surpluses are allocated to. It says things like the Water Quality Improvement Fund shall get this, that, or the other. It says that money will go back into the Revenue Stabilization Fund, our state's rainy day fund, to the extent that revenues are above forecast, things like that. And then there's sort of an undesignated amount that's left, where the governor has wide discretion on how to suggest to allocate that. So that too is a very important dynamic in terms of if there's money to be allocated at the end of the day, where is that going? And there have been efforts to, in recent years, for example, to reorder that pecking order, to bring transportation up higher in that pecking order. And I think also it's important to remember that if you go back through history, a lot of programs get some funding cut restorations done through end-of-year surpluses. And so if you think about like, well, do I really care whether transportation floats up to the top or something like that? I think there's a strong argument to be said that, yeah, you probably do. Because I bet you if you go back in past years, you'd probably see that various housing, human service type programs got some program funding restored in a surplus environment when there was a larger part of undesignated money than you would if you just defined away 100% of what any available surplus coming out. Because then you don't have access to that money. It's been defined away for you because it's been laid out in the statute who gets what when. Now, the other thing is to understand that the dynamic of this is it was not subject to the budget bill, the whole the whole session of the legislative consideration of these issues, and so you have a much stronger hand the governor has in making some of those suggested allocations at the outset. Yes.
Is the amount that the governor has to allocate, is that sort of limited as a percentage, or it's just more limited by the percentage that sort of automatically goes to the rainy day fund, less whatever particular line item, so there were.
So you start with what the surplus is, at a certain calculation is made that gives you this top line number, then you apply these various drawdowns that are designated by the statute, and then there's this residual amount left over. And then he has wide discretion to allocate that.
So I would think that a lot of the advocacy then is also in getting your program into the line item drawdown.
And that's a heavy lift. I mean, because you're saying, this, in the statute, I want to define that regardless of what's happening, we get priority over all the countless other priorities in the state. You know, we want a priority as defined by such and such. So that's a heavy lift. I mean, that's certainly the water quality improvement folks did that, and transportation folks have done that. So it's certainly a strategy that can be deployed, but it's a heavy lift.
But what about the budget cuts? I mean, when you just said that a lot of times the agencies will get their money back from the budget cuts if there turns out to be a surplus, is that through the governor or is that through the line item?
That's what I'm saying. Is so to the extent that there's an undesignated part, to the extent that there's a bottom number that gets determined after you take off these top line ones, right? Then certain programs have been able to get money back through that process, right? So understanding how important having that discretionary pot left over at the end is important. Like, you know, in terms of, for you all, the discussion around having transportation take a bigger and bigger chunk of that surplus is really important, because that means there's less left in the undesignated piece at the end for other program needs. See what I'm saying?
Right, I was just wondering if that sort of, because I would think you would want it to almost be standard language, that if an agency is able to cut its expenses, that it's an automatic line item that they get some of that back of the surplus.
The appropriators probably wouldn't buy into that.
Really? That's logic to me.
Yeah. But the reason I bring this up is I think, you know, this is very much an issue that that has been in the debate in Virginia these last few years as we've been booking these accounting surpluses. There have been all these proposals around having transportation take a bigger, you know, float up in the priority. So understanding how that impacts your services and your programs is really, really important, because that's, you know, that's a key thing. Yes, sir.
So does the governor allocate that undesignated surplus in next year's budget?
And then, yeah, in this caboose bill I was talking about, this kind of cleanup stuff, the General Assembly will have a say on that. But it's a very strong card he plays with this kind of a you know, a surplus allocation kind of thing. Okay, so let me move on to talking about some of the dynamics of the recent economy as a way to sort of understand